Louisiana, 1841. The air along the Mississippi River Delta hung heavy with humidity and the sweet, rotting scent of sugar cane. On a remote plantation several miles upriver from Louisiana's bustling port cities, whispers began to circulate about bodies found in drainage ditches and shallow, hurried graves. The deaths did not immediately alarm the wider public. In a slave-holding society built on brutality, disappearance was not unusual. But by late autumn, even seasoned overseers were unsettled. Something about these killings felt different. They were not acts of rebellion. They were not the predictable violence of punishment. They were deliberate, repeated, and disturbingly methodical. The central figures were two brothers, born into slavery on neighboring plantations and later sold together to a large sugar estate outside what is now New Orleans. Their names appear in surviving court fragments only as Caleb and Josiah, though historians debate whether those were their given names or ones assigned by record keepers. They were described as physically strong, quiet, and observant. Other enslaved laborers later recalled that the brothers worked efficiently, rarely spoke unless addressed, and seemed to move through the fields with a watchfulness that made others uneasy. In daily life they were unremarkable. They cut cane, repaired levees, and tended livestock. They shared a small quarters cabin at the edge of the property, near a cypress thicket where the land dipped into marsh. No formal education, no legal standing, no recognized family ties beyond each other. The plantation ledger described them as sound, capable field hands. Nothing more. The first confirmed death occurred in June of 1841. A white overseer named Thomas Hale failed to report for the morning count. His horse was found wandering near the cane rows. A search party located his body partially submerged in an irrigation canal. There were blunt force injuries to his head. The plantation owner concluded Hale had been ambushed, possibly by runaway slaves or thieves. Patrols intensified. Punishments increased, but no arrests were made. Over the following months, more bodies appeared. 2 itinerant traders vanished after camping near the plantation boundary. A neighboring farmer was discovered face down in a drainage ditch. 3 enslaved men from a nearby estate were reported missing after attempting escape. Weeks later, skeletal remains were found in the marshland between properties. At first, these events were treated as isolated incidents. Frontier conditions, swamp predators, bandits. There were explanations readily available in 1841. The turning point came when a local sheriff's deputy, investigating reports of stolen livestock, stumbled upon a shallow grave while tracking footprints near the cypress grove behind the brothers' cabin. The soil had been disturbed recently. When unearthed, the remains revealed signs of binding at the wrists. This was no accident, no animal attack. It was execution. By December, the body count connected by proximity had reached 9. Quietly, without public announcement, local authorities began compiling a list. They noted the geographic pattern. Every corpse was found within a 2-mile radius of the plantation. They examined timing. Most deaths occurred at night, often on Sundays when supervision was lighter. And they observed something else. No signs of forced entry or large-scale struggle. The victims appeared to have been lured or surprised. Suspicion did not immediately fall on the brothers. In the racial hierarchy of the antebellum South, enslaved men were rarely imagined as orchestrators of calculated serial violence against both white and black victims. Rebellion, yes. Organized uprising, perhaps. But secret, selective killing over months. That required a shift in thinking authorities were reluctant to make. The break in the case came from within the enslaved community itself. A young field hand, whose testimony survives in paraphrased court notes, reported seeing Caleb late one evening washing what looked like dark stains from a length of rope in the irrigation canal. When questioned informally by an overseer, the young man claimed that Josiah had warned others to stay away from the cypress grove after dark. "There are spirits there," he allegedly said, "spirits that do not forgive." Investigators searched the brothers' cabin. Beneath loose floorboards they discovered personal items belonging to several missing men. A trader's brass compass, a farmer's tobacco tin engraved with initials, scraps of cloth identified as part of an overseer's coat lining. There were also tools, axes, a mallet, lengths of rope, ordinary plantation equipment but stored separately, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Under interrogation, conducted without any of the protections modern readers would expect, the brothers initially denied involvement. Surviving records indicate that Caleb eventually confessed to multiple killings, though the conditions under which the confession was extracted remain unclear. According to the written summary, he claimed that each victim had earned judgment. Some had whipped him. Others had cheated enslaved workers out of promised food. A few were described as wanderers who would not be missed. But what unsettled authorities most was a line attributed to Josiah. When asked why they continued after the first killing, he reportedly said, "Because we could." That statement shifted the narrative from revenge to something darker. Investigators began re-examining earlier unexplained deaths in the parish. Over the next weeks, they linked an additional 26 disappearances to the same pattern of location and method. In total, authorities attributed 35 killings to the brothers, though modern historians caution that record-keeping was inconsistent and numbers may have been inflated to heighten the case's notoriety. It was after this cumulative figure emerged that the story spread beyond the parish. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. Word traveled along river routes and into city newspapers, though coverage was restrained, often framing the events as evidence of the supposed dangers of insufficient supervision. The deeper investigation revealed contradictions. Some of the alleged victims had known enemies unrelated to the brothers. At least 2 bodies were so decomposed that identification was speculative. There were no eyewitnesses to the actual killings. The prosecution's case relied heavily on confessions and the possession of personal effects. Yet physical evidence supported elements of the narrative. Footprints matching the brothers' shoe sizes were documented near several grave sites. A distinctive not used in bindings was demonstrated in court. Witnesses testified they had seen Caleb tie livestock with the same configuration. Soil found beneath the cabin floorboards matched samples from the Cypress Grove burial area. The plantation owner, facing scrutiny and potential financial loss, cooperated fully with authorities. Some historians suggest he may have encouraged a swift conclusion to protect his reputation and maintain order among the enslaved population. Public trials involving enslaved defendants in 1841, Louisiana were brief. Legal representation was minimal. Verdicts were often predetermined by local magistrates concerned more with deterrence than due process. During proceedings, no clear motive emerged that satisfied observers. Revenge accounted for certain names on the list, but others, travelers, small farmers, even 2 enslaved men from another estate, did not fit that pattern neatly. One theory proposed that the brothers initially acted in retaliation, but discovered that the swamp offered concealment. The marsh absorbed evidence. The social chaos of the region masked patterns. Another theory suggested coercion, that they may have been forced by an unknown third party to dispose of bodies, later blamed entirely when discovered. No solid proof supports this, but gaps in documentation leave room for speculation. Psychological interpretation is difficult across centuries. Contemporary accounts describe the brothers as calm during trial, neither defiant nor visibly remorseful. A minister who visited them before sentencing wrote that they spoke often of injustice but never asked for forgiveness. Whether this reflected hardened resolve, fatalism, or a narrative shaped by the recorder's bias remains uncertain. The final outcome was swift. Both were sentenced to death and executed publicly in early 1842. The location was chosen deliberately, near the edge of the plantation fields, visible to enslaved workers and local residents alike. Official records state that order was maintained and that the event concluded without incident. There is no mention of marked graves. After their execution, reported killings in the immediate area ceased. That fact strengthened the belief in their sole responsibility. Yet in the years that followed, occasional skeletal remains continued to surface in the marshlands, remnants of a violent era where many deaths went undocumented. Today, the case survives only in fragmented court transcripts, plantation ledgers, and brief newspaper columns preserved in archives. The number 35 is repeated often, but whether it reflects confirmed victims or accumulated suspicion is still debated. What is clear is that in 1841, in the oppressive heat of rural Louisiana, two enslaved brothers stood accused of orchestrating one of the deadliest killing sprees in the region's recorded history. Their story forces uncomfortable questions. Were they calculating predators who exploited a system already saturated with violence? Were they products of an environment where brutality blurred moral boundaries? Or were they, in part, shaped by narratives constructed by authorities eager to assert control? The swamp where the graves were found has long since been drained and replanted. The cypress grove is gone, but the silence that settled over that plantation in the winter of 1841 lingers in the historical record, a reminder that even in a time defined by systemic cruelty, individual acts of violence could still shock a hardened community. In the end, the official file closed with 2 executions and a declared resolution. Yet the unanswered questions remain buried, somewhere beneath the shifting soil of Louisiana's past. The official record ends with the executions in early 1842, but the paper trail does not disappear. In the months that followed, parish correspondence reveals a quiet but persistent anxiety. Plantation owners along the Mississippi corridor increased night patrols. Informal curfews were tightened. Lanterns were hung at crossroads that had previously gone dark after sunset. The killings had stopped, but fear did not. What disturbed authorities most was not only the number attributed to the brothers, but the duration. According to reconstructed timelines, the first suspected murder may have occurred as early as late 1839. If accurate, that would mean nearly 2 years of intermittent killings without detection. In a tightly controlled plantation environment, that fact suggested either remarkable cunning or systemic blindness. Investigators reviewing the case after the executions attempted to understand how the pattern went unnoticed. One factor was geography. Rural southern Louisiana in the 1840s was a maze of bayous, marshes, cane fields, and shifting riverbanks. Heavy rains could erase footprints within hours. Flood cycles dislodged shallow graves. Wild animals scattered remains. A missing person might simply be assumed drowned or devoured by the swamp. Another factor was record-keeping. Enslaved individuals who disappeared were not always formally documented beyond a brief ledger notation: absent, runaway, or deceased. Poor farmers and itinerant traders who failed to return home often left no centralized record at all. Communication between parishes was slow. Patterns that seem obvious when compiled in a single archive were nearly invisible in real time. There was also reluctance to publicize the possibility that 2 enslaved men had eluded detection for so long. To admit that was to acknowledge vulnerability in a system built on control. Several newspaper references from the region framed the case not as a failure of oversight, but as an example of what could happen when discipline was insufficient. That narrative conveniently redirected blame. Testimony collected during the investigation offers fragmented glimpses into the brothers' routines. They were known to volunteer for night tasks, checking levees after storms, tending to livestock during birthing season, retrieving tools left in distant sheds. These responsibilities granted them mobility after dark. Mobility in that environment was power. One former overseer from a neighboring estate, interviewed months later, recalled a minor but telling detail. He had once encountered Josiah walking alone near the property boundary well past midnight. When challenged, Josiah calmly explained he was searching for a stray mule. The explanation was plausible. The overseer let him pass. Only after the arrests did that memory resurface with new meaning. Physical evidence cataloged in parish notes included a heavy wooden mallet bearing faint discoloration, and a length of rope with fibers consistent with bindings found on 2 bodies. There were no forensic laboratories, no chemical analyses. Identification relied on observation and testimony. A distinctive brass compass discovered beneath the cabin floor was positively identified by a relative of one missing trader. That object became one of the prosecution's central exhibits. Yet inconsistencies remain in the surviving summaries. At least 3 alleged victims were never conclusively identified. Their names appear in later retellings but are absent from the original court abstracts. This raises the possibility that the number 35 was a cumulative estimate rather than a confirmed count. In an era without standardized investigative procedures, inflation, intentional or accidental, was not uncommon. Motivation continues to be debated by modern historians who have revisited the case through archived parish documents. One interpretation views the killings as calculated retribution, evolving into opportunistic violence. Early victims were directly connected to documented punishments inflicted on the brothers. Later victims had weaker or no known ties. That progression suggests a shift from targeted revenge to something less easily categorized. Another interpretation focuses on psychological adaptation within an environment saturated by violence. Enslaved individuals lived under constant threat of physical harm. Public whippings were common. Executions for rebellion were staged as warnings. Some scholars argue that exposure to normalized brutality may have altered moral thresholds. In that view, the brothers' actions were not born in isolation, but emerged from a system that treated human life as expendable. There is also the question of whether all attributed killings were truly theirs. 2 bodies discovered in early 1840, one bore knife wounds inconsistent with the blunt force pattern described in most testimonies. At trial, prosecutors suggested variation in method. However, private correspondence between a deputy and a parish clerk hints at uncertainty. One letter references other matters in the swamp which may not concern the Negroes alone. The meaning of that phrase is unclear. It could imply unrelated criminal activity in the region that was ultimately folded into a single narrative for the sake of closure. The enslaved community's reaction was scarcely documented, but indirect evidence suggests a mixture of fear and distance. None publicly defended the brothers. No petitions for clemency appear in the archives. That absence could indicate agreement with the verdict, or a strategic silence in a society where speaking carried risk. The public execution itself was described in restrained language by a regional paper. It noted a considerable gathering and emphasized that the sentence was carried out efficiently. There is no detailed account of the brothers' final words, only a brief statement that they maintained composure. Whether that composure was genuine or simply recorded as such by observers intent on reinforcing a narrative of resolved order is impossible to determine. After their deaths, plantation security practices shifted subtly. Night patrol rotations became more structured. Some estates required paired oversight rather than single overseers riding alone. Lantern posts were installed at key junctions between fields and marshland. These changes imply that, despite official declarations of restored control, vulnerability had been acknowledged internally. Over time, the case faded from regional memory. Larger historical events, the intensifying national debate over slavery, economic fluctuations in the sugar trade, and eventually the approach of the Civil War, overshadowed local crime stories. By the late 19th century, references to the brothers appear mainly in sensationalized retellings rather than formal histories. When 20th century researchers revisited parish archives, they found the documentation incomplete. Several original depositions were missing. Weather damage had rendered portions of the court ledger illegible. What remains is a skeletal outline, dates, partial names, itemized evidence, a verdict. The physical landscape has transformed since 1841. Levees have been reinforced, marshes drained, agricultural patterns altered. Yet ground-penetrating surveys conducted in the late 20th century during land development projects reportedly uncovered unmarked burial sites in areas corresponding to the old cypress grove. Those remains were not conclusively linked to the case, but their presence reinforces a broader truth about the region. Many deaths from that era remain unrecorded. In evaluating the story today, historians caution against simplistic conclusions. Labeling the brothers as purely monstrous overlooks the violent structure surrounding them. Casting them solely as victims erases the reality that multiple people lost their lives. The surviving evidence supports involvement in several killings. Whether the full count reached 35 may never be proven. What is certain is that, for nearly 2 years in the humid isolation of rural Louisiana, individuals disappeared with alarming regularity. The pattern was subtle enough to evade immediate detection, yet consistent enough to leave traces once examined collectively. 2 men were arrested, tried, and executed. Officially, the threat ended there. But the deeper questions remain unresolved. How many victims were accurately identified? Were all deaths truly connected? Did systemic blind spots allow the violence to persist longer than it should have? And perhaps most unsettling, if the grave in the cypress grove had not been discovered by chance, how long would it have continued? The case file closes with a date and 2 signatures. No photographs exist. No recorded voices survive. Only fragments of ink on aging paper and the quiet acknowledgement that beneath the orderly rows of 19th-century plantation fields, something far more chaotic once unfolded. In the stillness of that winter in 1842, the parish declared the matter settled. Yet history, when examined closely, rarely offers conclusions so clean. In the decades after 1842, the plantation changed ownership twice. Sugar prices fluctuated. Flood seasons reshaped the boundaries of the land. By the time the Civil War reached Louisiana, many of the people who had witnessed the investigation were gone, dead, relocated, or silent. The case of the 2 brothers lingered only as a cautionary anecdote, passed quietly between landowners along the river. But archival fragments suggest the story did not end with their execution. In 1853, more than a decade later, a letter surfaced in parish records written by a former deputy who had assisted in the original arrests. He addressed a colleague in another district, referencing the matter of the swamp killings. In the letter, he admitted lingering doubt about at least 4 of the attributed victims. He wrote that pressure to close the case had intensified once the number of suspected dead surpassed 20. The parish required certainty, he stated. And certainty was provided. That single line has fueled modern debate. What did certainty mean in 1841 rural Louisiana? It did not mean forensic proof as we understand it today. It meant a narrative strong enough to restore order. Several names on the victim list belonged to individuals who had financial disputes unrelated to the brothers. One small landholder had been involved in a property boundary conflict weeks before his disappearance. Another alleged victim, a trader, was rumored to have debts in multiple parishes. The possibility that some deaths were the result of separate altercations cannot be dismissed. Yet once the brothers were charged, investigators consolidated open cases under a single explanation. The psychological dimension remains difficult to untangle. Surviving testimony describes Caleb as deliberate, rarely reacting impulsively. Josiah was portrayed as quieter, more reserved, often deferring to his brother during questioning. One jailer's account, preserved in a local memoir decades later, claimed that Caleb requested reading material during his confinement, not religious texts, but newspapers. Whether this detail is accurate or embellished cannot be verified, but it suggests an awareness of the broader reaction their case generated. There is no evidence they attempted escape after arrest. That absence is striking. Escape attempts among enslaved individuals facing execution were not unheard of, yet records indicate compliance. Some historians interpret this as resignation. Others argue it may reflect confidence that they had already said what authorities wanted to hear. The confession itself is another point of scrutiny. In Antebellum, Louisiana, interrogations of enslaved suspects were not governed by procedural safeguards. Physical coercion was legal. Psychological pressure was routine. While Caleb's admission to several killings appears consistent across summaries, the expansion of that number to 35 may have emerged during repeated questioning sessions. Without original transcripts, it is impossible to separate voluntary acknowledgement from forced elaboration. After emancipation in 1865, formerly enslaved individuals who had lived on the plantation were interviewed during Reconstruction by various federal agents documenting conditions in the South. Only one brief mention of the brothers appears in these materials. An elderly man recalled 2 field hands who killed the driver. He did not mention dozens of victims. He described the atmosphere afterward as tense, like the sky before a storm. His account suggests that within the enslaved community, the perception of the killings may have been narrower than the official tally implies. By the late 19th century, regional folklore had transformed the brothers into almost mythic figures. In some retellings, they were avengers striking back at cruelty. In others, they were portrayed as inhuman predators lurking in the cane fields. Both extremes distort the limited documentary evidence. The truth, constrained by fragmentary records, appears more restrained yet no less unsettling. A series of deliberate killings carried out in secrecy over an extended period, within a system already defined by violence. Modern criminologists who have reviewed summaries of the case note patterns consistent with organized offenders, selection of isolated locations, control of victims through binding, concealment of remains, and temporal spacing between incidents. Yet applying contemporary profiling retroactively carries risk. Social context: in 1841, rural Louisiana differs radically from modern environments. Opportunity, surveillance, and community structure operated under different assumptions. Geographic analysis of the plantation layout, based on reconstructed maps, reveals that the cypress grove sat at a convergence point between field paths and a narrow waterway. It was a natural blind spot. Sound carried poorly through dense cane. Lantern light from the main house would not reach the grove's interior. Anyone familiar with the terrain could navigate it easily in darkness. The plantation owner's role also deserves scrutiny. While no evidence suggests direct involvement, his swift cooperation with authorities and insistence on public execution align with economic incentives. Prolonged uncertainty threatened productivity. Enslaved workers frightened by unexplained disappearances might resist night assignments. Neighboring estates might question management competence. A decisive resolution restored confidence. There is no indication that the owner pursued deeper inquiry into potential accomplices or unrelated crimes. Once the brothers were condemned, the matter was administratively closed. This raises the possibility that investigative boundaries were shaped not only by evidence, but by what outcomes best served local stability. In the early 20th century, when drainage projects expanded agricultural capacity in parts of southern Louisiana, labor crews reportedly uncovered additional human remains in areas corresponding to former marshland. Most were attributed broadly to the antebellum period. No systematic excavation was conducted. Without documentation, those remains became part of the region's layered history of unmarked graves. The absence of precise burial records for the executed brothers themselves adds another layer of uncertainty. Official statements note interment near the execution site. Later land surveys do not mark any such graves. It is possible that flooding altered the terrain, erasing physical traces. It is equally possible that deliberate anonymity was intended, preventing the site from becoming symbolic. The broader historical backdrop cannot be ignored. In 1841, Louisiana's economy was heavily dependent on sugar production. The demands of harvest season were relentless. Fatigue was common. Oversight often thinned at night. Social hierarchies were rigid, but enforcement varied with circumstance. Within that environment, individuals who understood routines and weaknesses could exploit them. And yet, despite all analysis, a central question persists. Why did no one speak earlier? If the brothers were responsible for even a fraction of the attributed deaths, they operated for months without exposure. Fear may explain some silence. So might disbelief. In communities accustomed to hardship, unusual events can be rationalized until patterns become undeniable. The parish ledger closes the file in early 1842 with 2 signatures affirming sentence carried out. There is no appendix listing confirmed victims with certainty levels, no map of grave locations, no preserved artifacts beyond what happened to survive in private collections. Today, historians reconstruct the case from scattered documentation, court abstracts, property records, personal letters, and brief newspaper columns archived in Louisiana repositories. Each source adds a fragment, but none provide complete clarity. The number 35 remains both central and unstable, repeated in retellings yet unsupported by a surviving master list. In the end, what can be stated with confidence is limited but significant. Multiple individuals died under suspicious circumstances in a confined geographic area between approximately 1839 and 1841. 2 enslaved brothers were arrested, confessed to at least some involvement, and were executed. After their deaths, the cluster of killings ceased. Whether that cessation proves sole responsibility or simply marks the closing of official inquiry remains uncertain. The sugar fields that once bordered the cypress grove have long since been replanted, harvested, and replanted again. Generations have passed, but beneath those fields lies a period when silence concealed violence, when systemic brutality blurred the line between rebellion and predation, and when resolution may have come at the cost of complete truth. The case does not offer a clean moral framework. It offers fragments of confession, of doubt, of fear, of administrative finality. And in those fragments, the shadow of 1841 endures, not as legend, but as a reminder of how easily certainty can be constructed when a community needs the terror to stop. As the years folded into decades, the killings of 1841 settled into the quiet margins of Louisiana's past. There were no monuments, no preserved crime scenes, no official plaques marking what had occurred in the cane fields and marshland beyond the plantation house. The land was productive again. Crops grew. Ownership changed. The violence receded into memory. Yet what lingers is not only the tally attributed to the 2 brothers. It is the structure that allowed such a series of deaths to unfold with so little immediate scrutiny. In antebellum rural Louisiana, life for enslaved individuals was defined by coercion, surveillance, and punishment. For landowners and overseers, authority was assumed to be absolute. The case disrupted that assumption. For nearly 2 years, according to reconstructed timelines, 2 men moved within that rigid system and operated undetected. The official narrative insists the violence ended with their execution in early 1842. Records indicate no further cluster of similar killings in the immediate vicinity. That cessation became proof of guilt in the eyes of parish authorities. Order, once restored, required no further questioning. But the gaps remain. There is no surviving comprehensive list of the 35 alleged victims. Some names appear in newspaper fragments. Others surface in later retellings without primary documentation. At least several of the bodies discovered were never conclusively identified. In a region where transient laborers, traders, and displaced individuals moved frequently along the Mississippi corridor, disappearance was not always followed by formal inquiry. Modern historians who revisit the archives approach the case cautiously. They separate confirmed evidence from repetition. They analyze court abstracts alongside plantation ledgers. They compare timelines against flood seasons and regional crime reports. And even with that careful reconstruction, certainty remains partial. Were all 35 deaths the work of Caleb and Josiah? The surviving documentation proves involvement in several killings beyond reasonable doubt by the standards of the time. Possession of personal items, geographic consistency, and confession align. But whether every disappearance folded into the total belonged to their actions cannot be proven conclusively. There is also the question of narrative consolidation. Communities under threat often prefer singular explanations. A single cause is easier to confront than a network of possibilities. Once the brothers were arrested and confessed to multiple murders, the incentive to attribute unresolved cases to them would have been strong. Closure carries social value. The psychological dimension, too, resists simple framing. If the brothers began with revenge against specific overseers or individuals who inflicted harm, that motivation reflects one kind of violence, retaliatory and targeted. If subsequent killings included strangers with no direct connection, that suggests escalation into opportunistic or compulsive behavior. The line between resistance and predation blurs in environments where brutality is normalized. What can be stated without speculation is this. Between roughly 1839 and 1841, multiple individuals died violently within a confined area of rural Louisiana. 2 enslaved brothers were apprehended, tried, and executed. After their deaths, the pattern of discovery ceased. The plantation fields where the cypress grove once stood have been replanted countless times since then. Drainage systems reshaped the marsh. Storms altered the soil. Any physical trace of the original graves has likely been lost to time. The execution site itself is unmarked. There are no confirmed burial locations for the brothers. History leaves behind paper more often than stone. Today, their story exists in fragments housed in regional archives and historical collections, parish ledgers, partial court transcripts, scattered newspaper columns. No photographs survive, no recorded voices, only ink, fatting but persistent. The case forces a confrontation with uncomfortable realities. It unfolded within a system already built on sanctioned violence. It reveals how easily prolonged wrongdoing can hide in plain sight when fear, hierarchy, and geography combine. And it illustrates how swiftly a community can accept resolution once a plausible culprit is presented. In the end, the file closes with finality. Sentence carried out, order restored. Yet beyond that administrative conclusion lies uncertainty that cannot be fully erased. Numbers repeated across generations are not always numbers verified. Confessions recorded under coercive systems do not always equal complete truth. And silence, whether born of fear or complicity, can distort history as effectively as deception. The swamp is gone. The cane rows are different. The people who lived through 1841 are long buried, but the questions remain suspended in the humid air of the past. How many truly died? How many stories were folded into one? And if the shallow grave near the cypress grove had never been uncovered, how long would the pattern have continued? The parish declared the matter finished in 1842. History, however, rarely ends so cleanly.